Okay, so I just wanted to do a quick review of Romanticism. I started going through some of the discussion posts that you guys had posted, which good debates on some items, and some of you have gotten some things correctly. But I do think that there's a little bit of confusion, or at least not necessarily picking up on the broad scope of everything that is part of Romanticism. And I'm just going to say right now, I'm really sorry if you hear dogs barking in the background. I have a couple of dogs, and I've locked myself in the office, and they're a little upset about that. But anyway, so just going to apologize right now if you hear dogs barking in the background. That's what that is. Um, so, as some of you pointed out, the idea of romanticism does have to do with romance in the sense of love and passion. But that's not the only thing. In fact, that's actually one of the most minor aspects of it. So, to camp out on all the love and sex and romance and that kind of ideas about romanticism is actually not correct. So, let's go through kind of what it is. It was definitely a reaction to the two main revolutions that were going on historically at the time. Now, as it mentioned in a lot of the overviews, the Romantic era of literature is one of the only eras in literature that doesn't come around some sort of monarch, especially when we're talking about British literature, since almost everything with the British literature and British history has to involve the kings and queens of the time. This is kind of one of the first times that we see something being discovered or talked about or named that has nothing to do with about who is politically in power. And that's a huge difference compared to like what's coming up in the Victorian era, which is obviously named after Queen Victoria. So keep that in mind. It's also one of the few ones that was named after the fact. So again, as it was pointed out in the introduction material, nobody during the actual time period that this was going on called themselves romantics. They had other words for themselves. They didn't really describe themselves of anything. Maybe they might call themselves reactionaries or revolutionaries or despondents or treasonous or whatever. They had all these other terms that were political, but it wasn't until the Victorians came into effect much later and they were looking back and saying, hey, wait a minute, there was this whole movement of literature and writers and philosophers and artists, and they seemed to capture the essence of romance or the Romantic era. And so they were the ones that actually called them the Romantic period of literature. So we kind of have that to thank. So it was kind of a new watershed, groundbreaking idea for a lot of things. So what are the two revolutions that I'm talking about? Well, obviously here in America, the American Revolution in 1776, but then that was followed closely by the French Revolution, right? And so they both have to do with the same idea. Lower subjugated people, whether it was the colonies here in America or the peasants in France, were upset with the fact that they were not getting treated equality-wise the same in the realm of the politics. For whatever reason, the king at the time did not grant them the same political venues. And so those groups decided to break away. Now, this comes at the same time as three really major pieces of writing. And this is kind of the introduction to the Romantic era, is these three pieces of writing. Not really books, kind of more pamphlets, but not really just a letter to the editor either. So it's kind of hard to tell you what they are. Novels hadn't really been introduced just yet. That's coming at the end of the Romantic era. So definitely not. But the first one, and you have parts of this to read, was Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Men. So she writes this in a sense to say, yes, mankind, not just men as in like the male species, but mankind has these certain rights that we should have. Now, and then soon after this, she writes her Vindication of the Rights of Women, because yes, a lot of her things do tend to follow the male gender in the rights of men, but she's using it more as like a universal way of espousing her ideas. You've got to understand that women at this time didn't really publish anything, and if they did, they certainly didn't want to offend the male business leaders, the one who was actually her publisher, by saying that women's rights rule and blah, 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 like we are very used to doing today. That would not have been tolerated back then, and we never would have heard of Mary Wollstonecraft after that. So she's tiptoeing around the subject very carefully by granting it specifically to the male gender, but she really means every single human being, that there are these certain rights that we have as human beings, and this is what that means. Thomas Paine came right along after that and said, yes, exactly, there are certain inalienable rights, I don't know if you've ever heard that phrase before, but you should, that all men have, created equal, And so you'll hear some of the same language in some of our founding fathers' writings. And so even though this is technically your British literature class, a lot of this bleeds into early American writing as well. And so, where did we get these ideas of why we should be able to separate from our mother country of England? It's because of these writings saying that, yes, we are not being treated equality of mankind. We are not being treated this way. We do deserve this. And so we're going to separate ourselves and create our own perfect union. So very much the founding fathers, Thomas Edison, Ben Franklin, those guys, were very influential from the romantic ideals. And so that's why I kind of want to go over this. It's not just about romance and love. There's some concrete foundational things that they believed in philosophically that have huge impact on us as Americans, because that's kind of what our founding country documents are from. The last little piece of writing that was kind of bigly influential was the Inquiry Concerning Political Justice. So this kind of came later. This was almost right after the French Revolution. And the idea was, is there such a thing as political justice? Can one ruling party basically force themselves upon another group, willing or unwilling? Is there such a thing as the right thing to do politically? If so, what is that? What do we as humans possess? Can we seek justice politically, or are those two things completely absent? Is justice one idea and politics completely amoral? It doesn't have anything to do with justice. It just is. And so what is that? And obviously this is a reaction to the French Revolution, where lots of people were massacred for seemingly stupid reasons. The crowd riots got way out of control. And so a lot of people after the American Revolution were like, yeah, let's go to the underdog. Woohoo, our rights to conquer everything. And then they got really, really scared after the French Revolution, because they're like, well, that's taking it a bit extreme. We weren't exactly thinking, mob riot rules and let's kill everybody. Let's kind of back that off a little bit. So it was kind of a big controversy between all of that. So that is kind of the political structure that's going into the Romantics. And you kind of have to understand that with literature. Literature is either at the forefront pushing something politically, or it is a reaction to something. And again, we're going to come back to that with Victorian. So everything is either pushing something forward or a reaction to something that they didn't like in the previous generations. Okay. And so I always have to kind of keep that tension in balance when you talk about anything having to do with literature. You have to know the past, and you have to kind of see where they're going, because it's always kind of, they're pushing one direction and running away from the other. So because of this and this idea of revolution, it's got some other issues that we have to deal with. There's huge economic changes obviously going on, historically speaking, right now. So the first one is a guy by the name of Adam Smith, who again, hugely influential in American writing as well. And his book, at this time I'll call it a book, it's again really kind of a little bit longer than a pamphlet, not quite a novel, but a pretty good size writing, so we'll call it a book. It's called The Wealth of Nations, and if you ever take a college economics class or business class or something like that, where you're really studying like macro versus micro economics, you're probably going to have to read it. It is still one of the foundational pieces of economics out there. And then you start getting into, Edison or Jeffersonian economics and that kind of stuff. But this is where this all started from. This guy wrote this hugely groundbreaking idea that now that we have all this modernization, again, turn of the century of 17 to 1800 century. I know that's kind of hard to think century wise way back here in 2018. But you have machines now, we have mining processes, we have the train coming, we have economic trade. So that way, if I wanted something from India, if I'm part of the British Empire, I can now get spices from India and silk from India. I don't have to wait 6 years for some guy on a horseback mule coming all the way across no, it just goes on a ship and it gets around, and we're pretty quick about it. So we have all these things. We have the rise of the middle class. We have all this stuff going. It's a huge shift economically from what they were used to. It used to be, if you remember from like old English literature class, if you took the previous literature class, you kind of had the king at the top, and he has a couple of lords that he entrusts with different acreages of land. Those lords then are like basically mini kings. They run their fiefdom, and then they have the servants, and that's it. You have those three classes, and it's not really a upper, middle, lower class. It's an upper class, and then an upper class, and then a like dirt poor rat class. Like there's not even poor class. Like you're just down there. But we've moved along and progressed socially, economically, now we have the rise of the middle class. So now you have upper class, which consists of people who own land and the gentry and the lords and ladies and all of that, as it always is. But now you have this new called the nouveau riche, which is French for new rich. So they have businesses, they do trade, they are a banker, they're, something along those lines, what we would call today white collar jobs. And they're educated and they've gone to college and they're creating this money, and they have money to spend now on things. And so they kind of create this middle class going, upper middle class, lower middle class. Yes, you still have those kind of distinctions, but they have this whole mercantile middle class going. And then you still have the dirt poor peasants. So Adam Smith writes this book called The Wealth of Nations, talking about how that now that we have the rise of this middle class, we need to change how we do things economically. The king cannot demand taxes from everybody and then just work ourselves to death to pay the taxes for the king. Like that does not work anymore now that we have trade, now that we have all this stuff. So he recommends, again, a very French idea called the laissez-faire economic system. And basically, laissez-faire in French means leave it alone. Don't touch it. So this isn't even trickle-down economics. This is like leave it the F alone economics. So this is how his idea works. People make money, they spend money. That's it. And if they want to keep the profits, they can keep the profits and leave them alone. The government's job is not to interfere with business at all, because you want people to be able to create business and create the money and to basically have a larger middle class. If the government gets involved in any sort of structure, whether it's through taxation, whether it's through embargoes, whether it's through whatever, it's messing and regulating with the structure and the ability to create wealth and business, and will therefore jeopardize the ability for the country to survive. So leave it alone. Government needs to get the heck out of the way of business. Sounds great in theory. Here's the problem with that, though, okay? So, and this is what we see in this time period, and then for sure when we get to Victorian England at the beginning, and Charles Dickens is going to be like one of the forefront authors for this one. So this is a huge deal with the Romantics, as well as then moving straight on into the Victorian era. So here's what happens. You have this rise of industrialization, right, with the steam engines and the factory workers and all this stuff that's going on, and it creates this wealthy economy. The government leaves them alone. They can be as wealthy and as profitable as they want to, but there is no incentive to not become more wealthy. In other words, I can be as greedy as I want to and it won't matter, because the government's not going to penalize me for being greedy, nor is the government going to reward me for being charitable. Like here in America, we get, if I donate money as a company or as a person, I donate money to charity or the church or whatever, I get a tax credit for that. And so I am rewarded for being not greedy with my money. And so that's kind of like one of the ways that can kind of stop. But they didn't have that back then. And so what happens is you have this great upper class and this middle class, and they just get greedier and greedier and greedier. And what happens then to the lower class? They get poorer and poorer and poorer, and the conditions are horrible. So you have children, which is going to be one of the big deals for Dickens. You have children working in these factories in deplorable conditions. I mean, it's disgusting if you ever actually think about this and do any research on it. You have them working in the coal mines as young as 5 years old, pulling these carts of heavy coal to run the factories, to run the electricity for the country. You have women, particularly Irish, because their economy in Ireland was so bad that they were coming to America, as well as England and Britain and London, all the major cities in Europe, to work in the factories. And so you had these horrible factory working conditions for women and other poor people. There were some men there too, but mostly it was women. You have the newspapers strikes going on, and it was just horrible working conditions for the low income workers, but it was great life for the rest. And so you have a huge dichotomy coming on with all of this. And so you see the Romantics dealing with this, okay? And so this is one of the things that they really don't like, and they're beginning to raise awareness of this, that there's these economic changes, there's this rise of stuff going on that we need to deal with politically, economically, socially. And so the Romantics are really one of the first groups of writers that we see just butting their heads up into this and dealing with it and talking about it and raising awareness of it and things like that as it comes along. And then that bleeds into the Victorian era for sure. They deal with it a lot more, I would say, strongly, voraciously, however you want to say that. And so the Victorians kind of pick up where the Romantics left off and just go blazing trailblazers straight ahead. All right, so some common themes and styles that you'll find in Romantic literature, and this is what I really, really wanted to kind of go over with you guys. Yes, there is love and there is romance, and there is the whole like, oh, he's the love of my life and my soulmate, and I'll never find anything else again. Like, yes, that is definitely where we get all of this. This is where we get the rise of Valentine's Day cards and chocolates and diamond engagement rings and all that other gushy stuff that we think of with love and romance and kissing and sex and all of that, and the romantic movies. Yeah, this is where all of it starts, and so that is part of it, but there is so much more that you guys need to necessarily understand. All right, one of the first biggest things is the idea of nature. Again, they're coming against the tide of industrialization. They see what is happening, that farmland is being turned into factories, that these children and these women are getting sent to these horrible working conditions. And for what? So that we can have, bread cheaper or lace cheaper or tea cheaper or whatever it is. And so they're really trying to get back to nature. Nature in all of its forms is divinity. Okay, and so this is where the term pantheism comes from. Pan meaning all things are God. So nature, I become one with nature, that very Zen Buddhist idea, right, that we have nowadays. It's the same idea back then. So we could become one with nature. I worship, I find God in nature. God is no longer in a building. God is no longer what my pastor says or my priest says. God is me sitting in the middle of a forest looking at the daffodil, or God is the cloud wandering across the sky as I remember my childhood. Right? So I become one with God. I become one with nature. I find my innermost self-revelation is huge right now. So I become God by focusing on nature and coming back to a very innocent, childlike, peaceful nature. Okay. And so, I'm going away from the industry. I will take a walk, right? Two roads diverged down a road and I walked. I took the path that was less traveled by. I'm not going to the industrialization. I know that's an American reference, but you all know that poem too. So, I'm going against the industry. I'm going against the path less traveled by. I am going down the one that nobody goes to. I'm going down nature. I'm going to find it. And so anything in nature that represents that pureness, that's the word you want here. Nature is purity. Okay. And so we see this in the poems. Poetry is a huge art form for the Romantics, specifically the lyrical poem, and I'll get to that in just a minute. But if you think about it in terms of like some of the American literature that you're familiar with, think of like the Scarlet Letter, okay? Hester and Pearl are seen as innocent and pure and lovely, and they live in the forest. Okay, all the bad people live in the city. So you start seeing this dichotomy between nature, things in nature. People who live in nature are good and innocent and perfect, even if they've quote unquote made mistakes, because they've only made mistakes based on what the bad people in the city have said that they've made a mistake on. They're not really bad because they're one with nature. All right, so people that live in the woods, people that talk to the woodland sprites, the little bunny creatures, whatever it is, like they are correct. No matter what they're telling you, those are correct because they are one with nature. They are innocent. They are not marked by the horrible life of the city. And so the other way this comes out is with children, right? So children represent the innocence of life because they haven't been marked by the badness of life, the corruptness of the city and the hard life and all that kind of stuff. So again, we see this a lot in poetry. We see this a lot in some of the novels. Children speak truth. Children speak innocence. Children are the angels, the cherubs. This is when that starts coming up is the cherubim idea, right? Up until now, angels were pretty kind of scary creatures based on biblical interpretation of passages. They had swords and flaming arrows and big, huge wings. And this is the time period when we start seeing them as the cute, fat, chubby little babies with little cute tiny wings and all that. This is that time period, okay? Because we want innocence and angelic creatures and all this. Mary Wollstonecraft, as well as other female writers at the time, used that idea to try and help women actually advance women's rights. All right, so again, not very common to have women authors at this time because women were not supposed to be educated like women. Men go off and make the money and do all that manly job stuff, and women just take care of the house. So Wollstonecraft and several others, and you'll read this in the Vindication of the Rights of Women, use the idea of children to their advantage. So they write saying, shouldn't a mother be the most educated person because she has the most fantastic job of being this child's first teacher? And you don't want to scar and ruin that innocence with all horrible stuff that she doesn't know. You want the mom to be the most educated person so that she can then educate the child and keep it in that perfect sense of perfection as long as possible. And so while Wollstonecraft didn't get very far with her ideas and her advances during her life period time, Victorian writers pick up on that. And so when we get to like Victorian with Austen and Bronte and all them, like they pick up on that and they run with it, and it tends to become tons more popular back then. So same idea, just hang on to it for a couple of lectures and we'll get to that. So it's coming. All right. So nature is probably one of the most important things with this style of writing. Lyric poem is the number one style. As I said, novels hadn't really been invented yet. That comes a little bit later near the end of it. Definitely by the time we get to Gothic and Victorian, novels are the thing. But at this point, the lyric poem is the one that is the most used writing style. And it's kind of an unusual one because they write a lot in first person. And you'll notice this with Wordsworth, and you'll notice it with Coleridge and almost every poet. When they write a lyric particularly if it's a ballad, right? So ballads are a big one. The lyric poem, they use the first person narrative. And this, what separates this from other lyric poems like in the 1600s and 1700s earlier, is that the speaker is not just this random speaker guy. Like, and I'm sure that was drilled into you if you ever took another literature class. And this is one of the hardest things about reading poetry, is that we want to automatically go, oh, well, it says, I saw a cloud, so that must be Wordsworth standing there as a child. And your English teacher would be like, no, 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 the speaker is its own person. It's not the actual author. You can't just put the author in there. All right, well, while that's true for other time periods, that is not true with the Romantics. The Romantics put themselves as the narrator. So when it says, I wandered lonely as a cloud, it really means I, Wordsworth, wandered lonely as a cloud. He is putting himself as the subject. And so you can actually say in this poem, the author did blah, 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 and be correct about that, because they are synonymous. The I is the author and the author is the I. And so that was really a kind of a brand new thing to do in the Romantics, and they loved it because it, again, went back to the idea of innocence. I am connecting with nature in this lyrical poem, and I have discovered an epiphany, a new revelation of deeper meaning within myself, and I'm sharing it with the world so that you too can join me on this epiphany. And so it's all about self-discovery through that. So another kind of theme there. All right, as I've kind of hinted at and talked about several times, feelings and emotions are huge with the Romantics. Yes, romantic feelings, yes, romantic, lovey-dovey emotions, all that kind of stuff, but not just that. Go beyond that. Any feeling, hatred. If I hate you so much, it must be correct. Otherwise, I would not hate you so much. Like, you must be at fault for that. If I am so sad and my entire life is no longer worth living and I commit suicide, I am correct in that. Like, you can't sit there and tell me that I was wrong or, oh my goodness, da da da. Like, that then is celebrated. Oh, that passionate person, he died by taking his own life. Hurrah, good job. We should all do likewise. Let's all go slit our throats in unison. And they did. Like, people would actually commit suicide in honor of someone committing suicide. So it's kind of like this thing where they would do friend pacts where, like, well, if I kill myself and I write a letter, a suicide note, then all you guys commit suicide too. And they did. And so it's like this crazy thing where people would be like, oh, that's the greatest expression of true love is to kill yourself. And you're like, well, I'm not too sure about that, right? Intuition replaced education, right? So feelings over intellect. So it doesn't matter what the smart thing is to do. It matters how I feel. So yes, I owe money to my landlord and I must pay my rent. So intellectually, I should get up and go to work so that I can have money to pay my landlord. But I do not feel like getting up and going to work today, so I'm going instead to go sleep all day long or get drunk and sleep all day long. I feel much better that way. Now, when my landlord comes to throw me out, that is not my fault. Because I didn't go to work and get money to pay him, because I didn't feel like it. So my feelings are what trumps. So whatever I feel at the time is correct. And if my feelings change, then so be it. So again, if I fall in love with you and my feelings say that I love you and I'll love you forever and ever and ever and ever and ever again, and then, oh my goodness, well, she's a lot prettier than you are, so my feelings now have changed for her, I am entirely correct in changing who I want to marry or have sex with or whatever. And the other girl will just have to deal with it because my feelings have changed and my feelings are correct. So you can see where we still think this way a lot in modern day times, right? And for some people, you don't necessarily see the dangers of that. But there are some, it does need to be in balance. I'll say not 100% ignoring feelings can be bad too. But this is kind of where we start seeing the praise of feelings over the disdain of intellect. Again, emotions over education. We don't need to go to school. Boys don't need to go to school. We don't need to go to college. We don't need to do anything. I should just know how to do it. I should just I should just know. So if I want to become a wood chopper today, because I am out in nature and I'm feeling kind of woodsy and I don't know, I grew a chest hair today, so I'm just going to swing that axe and get to it. I will know how to do a wood chopper. I'll just know. Never mind the fact that I've never done that before and I'm going to chop my leg off, but I'm just going to know. So now if I don't know how to do it, if I have no intuition, if I have no emotions to it, then obviously I don't need to know that. Okay, so that's kind of how their intuition emotions went, is that I will either know how to do it instinctively, whether I've had any training, no matter how complicated that task is. I shouldn't need any training. I'll just pick it up and know, or I don't need to do that. And then again, the idea of going away from tradition. So we don't need to worry about finding a good, stable job. We don't need to worry about finding a good, stable marriage, partnership. We don't need to worry about, buying a house with a good, solid foundation. We're just going to wing it. Like, we'll just let our emotions dictate us, whatever we need to do, and let luck fall where it goes. And if I end up destitute and poor, then so be it, but at least I was happy doing it. So it was just really kind of topsy-turvy. And you can see how that would be very concerning for older people, especially coming out of the revolutionary idea. They want stability. They want the countries to be stable. They don't want to go through another revolutionary war period. And so the older people and the ones with all the land and the money are really concerned about all these new young upstarts coming up with this idea that like, what the hell, we don't care, whatever happens, que sera, let's just go and live life and blah. That's very disconcerting for them, very impulse driven. So no reason, you don't plan things. If you just let the road take you wherever the road takes you. And if you end up dead, you end up dead. If you end up married, you end up married. If you end up lost, you end up lost. Like whatever it is, you just go. And the idea is just to go and passion and be. So yeah, very much impulse. The other idea is they strive for anything that is the ideal. So the ideal woman is, not necessarily just physically beautiful, but intellectually beautiful, right? She walks in beauty like the night. So we talk about her ideas and her eyes and her vision. I don't care what she looks like, down below her face. She's my soulmate. She's the ideal person. The ideal hero, the Byronic hero, right? Is a guy who's not necessarily strong and handsome like Superman, but more emotionally connected with me. He understands me emotionally. He gets me. He can cry with me when the poor little dog dies or whatever it is, right? He gets me emotionally. He's dark and brooding and he goes out in a flash of glory and dies. Like that's the Byronic hero. Or he's very moody and sulky because he is not able to attain that which he wants. So there's also this idea of wanting exotic things. So a lot of poems and a lot of stories take place in exotic lands. Ozymandias, right? And Kubla Khan. And so looking to all these ancient, different Persian lands, this land of exoticness, what does that mean? You'll see this talking about like when they do describe women, she had an exotic beauty. All right, so this is where we get the black-haired beauties, the temptress, the witch kind of look, as opposed to the pale, fair, blonde girl from the medieval times, which is the damsel in distress that needs rescuing. That's still there in the sense that there's still women who need to be rescued and shown, but they're more of an exotic type. So they have the black hair, they have darker skin, they have an Indian complexion, things of that nature. And then passion rules all. So if I want to go and do it, then by God, I'll go do it. You see this in the life of like Byron. And Keats and some of the other poets, where they went off and they took their vast fortune, which again, they didn't invest it in anything, they don't know anything. They took their vast fortune and they backed some like ragtag band of army guys down in Italy, and they led the brigade and died in a massive hailstorm of bullets. But they went out with a blaze of glory and they did what they wanted, and it was great and idealistic and passionate and brah. So they lived the life that they were preaching. So very much you see those themes in there as well. What happens to me when I die? How do I want to die? I want to remember, the past and say that I did something, and I want to go out in a blaze of glory. I don't want to just die of old age in a nursing home somewhere. I want to die at age 25 on top of a whatever it is, right? Doing something fantastic. So yeah, that's kind of how they go. So those are the big key things. Yes, it does kind of have to do a little bit with the romantic ideas, but there's so much more. The idea of nature being innocent and godlike, of going with feelings and emotions over logic and reason and intellect, being honest and spontaneous and exotic and just passionate about everything. If you're going to eat food, don't eat mom's meatloaf. You want to eat quail eggs and escargot because it's weird and different. Just do something that's passionate about. So live life to the fullest kind of idea. So keep that in mind, that all of this is going to blend into Gothic, which I'm going to do another little presentation on Gothic. And then that's going to definitely bleed into the Victorian era. All right, so hopefully that clears up a little bit of confusion for you. You guys are off to a good start, so if you have any questions, just feel free to email me. Thanks.